Hello and welcome back to Chapter 2 for Intro to Business. One of the nice things about this chapter is it's a little more focused than Chapter 1. Chapter 1 being an overview and sort of a kind of a beginning spot. They covered a lot of material. You'll find the material in Chapter 2 to be a little more focused, a little more manageable, I think. So let's dive into it. So a big part of the first part of the term here is thinking about the context in which business takes place. And so you've got, the macro environment or the macro economy in which it takes place, the culture, the social norms and mores, the ethics, and then, of course, legal constraints. So all of these are sort of explored in the first part of the term for us. And so we're starting out here thinking about business ethics and comparing and contrasting that idea from social responsibility. Business ethics is kind of ethical behavior in business, and I think unfortunately we've all seen businesses behaving unethically. But I would encourage you to remember that that the bad things that we see happening in the news is not the norm of what's happening on a day-to-day basis. And so I think there are a lot more people struggling to both do good and to have ethical business practices than maybe what we think if we just take a snapshot of the fear-based news and media. And so bear that in mind. That's not to deny that, of course, there are unethical business behaviors. And one of the difficulties is that there are different ways of evaluating ethics. And then there, of course, are pressures to perform for various groups within businesses, or what we'll identify later as stakeholders within businesses, who may have competing needs. And so it is definitely worthy of taking some time to consider how these different stakeholders and different ideas interact with each other within the business setting. So social responsibility is sort of a newer or different term than the ethics idea, and this is more of a broader look at how a company interacts with society in a more holistic way, as opposed to just an individual decision way, and whether or not a company can be a positive impact. Social responsibility tends to focus in the business arena right now around things like environmental issues, sustainable design, avoiding negative externalities in terms of things like pollution, supply chain fairness, fair wages for people in economies or environments with lower economic standards. And so you'll see a variety of companies doing a variety of different things on these fronts. And so let's set the table, so to speak, with who we think about when we think about ethical issues and possibly even social responsibilities. And not we, but the business community has coined this phrase stakeholders, which is not to be confused with shareholders, which have an ownership interest in a corporation. Stakeholders is a broader category of people that have an interest. So certainly employees have an interest in a business succeeding, and then also in the decisions that businesses make. Owners and shareholders have an interest. Customers are becoming more and more influential, particularly as we move away from a production-oriented economy into a market-oriented economy. And with the rise of social media, customers can exert their influence on companies to a greater level. The communities in which businesses operate, and then, of course, the environment or the global landscape as a whole. So the chapter presents some business ethical issues and sort of a variety of things that have come up, but it offers us this strategy where we look at a problem, we sort of think about the different options that may be available to solve a business problem. And then the real crux of this is where we look at how different stakeholders may react. And then we kind of come up with some criteria in terms of evaluating our decision process, and then we select from the best option. And just to give you some examples, what may be good for employees may not be good for the community or the environment, or what is good for shareholders may not be good for some of the other parties in the stakeholder situation. So step 3 in my mind is really the crux of the problem, and trying to sort of look at different stakeholders, at least raising our conscious level to the point where we're kind of considering how these different groups might react. And then in a more complicated sense, we will even go so far as to look at how those different groups might apply different ethical models to their evaluation of a particular problem. So speaking of ethical models, one of the things that makes ethics incredibly difficult, much more difficult in some ways than simply complying with the law. The law is fairly prescriptive. There's precedents and things that go into legal decisions and to the way administrative rules and laws are structured, that we can generally kind of know what they mean and follow them. With ethical dilemmas, it's more difficult because different people apply different lenses upon which they evaluate our activities. So these are just 3 of possible models in which we might be evaluated. And so the utilitarian approach is really an approach that says, well, whatever decision just needs to create the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And so it's not really very individually focused, and so you certainly can justify some courses of action that can be very harmful to a very small minority of individuals, or maybe even to single people under the utilitarian approach, as long as the benefits are great enough to justify that. So the greatest good for the greatest number of people. I think because business is an amalgamation of these different stakeholders' interests, we tend to migrate towards a utilitarian approach in business, because there's always these trade-offs that we tend to have to deal with. What is good for employees might not necessarily be good for owners, or we certainly work hard to try to find alignment where all these things can come into some kind of a nice balance where everybody can benefit. But I think we err on the side of the utilitarian approach when faced with difficult trade-offs in the business environment. A rights-based approach would be an approach that sort of indicates that each individual has a certain rights that must be preserved or not be trampled on. This is, of course, this is very familiar to us here in the United States because, there's the Bill of Rights, and we're used to having certain, we use the term inalienable rights. But you can certainly look at stakeholders and see when groups may present a rights-based approach. And I think that, I'll just throw out a current example. If you've followed the youth environmental movement at all, they sort of espouse a rights-based approach, that they have some basic rights to reasonable health in the distant future, and that humanity on a longer term scale has certain rights that shouldn't be violated. And again, you may not agree with that approach, but it is a rights-based approach that's coming into play. And many times when you see a somewhat powerful entity, say a big multinational corporation, maybe pursuing some course of action where it perceives that it is following the model of the greatest good for the greatest number of people, that can sort of bump into the rights of less powerful stakeholders, usually community members and or employees in an area that doesn't enjoy the level of power that maybe the corporation does. The golden rule, do unto others as you would have done unto you, is an approach that is also sometimes used within ethical models, and it's at its basis, it's somewhat of a fairness model. Some people take it a bit further and they go, well, you should treat people how you would like to be treated. And this will come into play also within businesses. Employees might take this approach. Consumers may perceive things to be unfair, and so you have different groups who are applying different models. And it may even be, it certainly is the case that there are more models beyond just these three. These are kind of the three more prevalent ones that we think about. So each stakeholder group is going to take a different approach, and it can be useful to a corporation to be consciously aware of how all those different stakeholders are going to evaluate your decision-making process, so that you can possibly you may be able to mitigate the impacts of your decision, or at least at the very least you may be able to better justify or communicate your position that you've taken if you understand these models more thoroughly. Now here's some types of ethical problems that are a little bit more smaller scale, and I guess for lack of a better term I'll think of them as more precise. Bribes and gifts. And let me back up just a step here. I think it's important for you as an individual to think about, what kind of ethical models do you want to follow, or are consistent with your personality and makeup, and that you can feel good about yourselves when you operate under those ethical models, and then trying to design your life, whether it be your personal life or your economic life, in such a way that it's fairly consistent with those ideals, because it can be very troublesome to an individual when they're maybe trying to follow an ethical model that's a certain way in a company that they work in, but kind of conflicts with them at a personal level. And so these ideas are important both from a business perspective and from a individual perspective. And so these types of ethical problems, bribes and gifts, in the U.S., the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act makes it illegal for U.S. corporations, even while operating in other countries where bribes and gifts may be a cultural norm, to participate in those. And so this is always an interesting idea too, when you're a multinational corporation and you've got a set of rules in a parent country and a different set of rules in other countries in which you operate, how to decide which set of rules are binding or most appropriate to follow. And it can be very difficult to conduct business in an environment where bribes and gifts are the norm if you're a business that doesn't practice that way. And that's not to encourage or promote sort of this decline to the lowest common denominator. I'm just pointing out that these things are sometimes easy to talk about when there's nothing involved, but they can become much more difficult when they become more real. Conflicts of interest. This is where your personal interests may be different than the people you're representing, or the people that you have agency for, or another party in a transaction. So that's important to consider and think about. This is certainly that comes up a lot in financial transactions, but it doesn't have to be exclusively in financial transactions. Insider trading. One of the things that we pointed out in the last discussion was this asymmetry of information as being sort of something that has a negative impact on the idea of free markets and capitalism. And so within trading, stock trading, one of the things that we try to do is we try to make sure, or we attempt to try to make sure that there's at least some chance of symmetry of information. And so those people who have access to inside knowledge because they participate in a business, are forbidden from using that information to their advantage or to prevent them from harm. And so you'll see some issues with insider trading every once in a while within the markets. And then fiduciary responsibilities. This is kind of when you have a conflict of interest or when you take on a monetary and economic responsibility for another party. Fiduciary responsibilities indicate that you're supposed to put their interest above your own. Which is, we think of trades or transactions as being mutually beneficial, but in some cases, to protect certain parties, if you take on a fiduciary responsibility, you're required to make sure that you even put their responsibilities ahead of and first in relationship to your own responsibilities. And these are interesting things, right? Because certainly attorneys and CPAs have a fairly high fiduciary responsibility to their accountants. As a matter of fact, a CPA has a higher responsibility to their clients than an investment trader. An investment trader does not necessarily have, there are certain rules that govern that activity, but it may or may not be a fiduciary responsibility. And so it can help you as you sort of navigate the business environment also to think about how you want to structure these transactions, or how you might want to know what kind of responsibilities different parties may have in relationship to you, or you in relationship to them. So as we kind of, we're just kind of touching around the margins of these ethical issues, organizations certainly have, they have their own ways of dealing with these things. We as individuals, we incorporate these things into our individual decision-making processes, but at an organizational level, part of what you want to think about is what's the culture? Is the culture that, you can have a culture that has a high ethical standard, that has a stakeholder analysis and really tries to think thoughtfully about how to come up with, optimal decisions. Or you can have a culture where our only goal is to maximize shareholder profit. And as long as it is good for investors, that's the only thing that matters. And there are still, profit maximization and owner profitability as being the sole and only requirement is still fairly prevalent. You'll run across and find it even in today's economy. So creating this culture of what your business's ethical standards are going to be. And of course, part of creating that culture is how you act and the decisions that you make, but it's also the policies, the procedures, and you can have a code of conduct as well. And so policies are sort of broader than procedures. Procedures are sort of like operating how you do stuff. Policies tend to be at a little bit larger scale. They're a little bit more the intent or what we hope to accomplish. So boards create policies. They may have disclosure policies about conflicts of interest, and then there may be procedures that support those policies. Beyond that, also, that you can have a code of conduct, and then many professions may also have a code of conduct. So you have a code of conduct for the medical profession, for attorneys, for CPAs or accountants, and so different entities that license professionals, whether they be nurses or teachers, have codes of conduct that present some basic ethical standards in which the profession is trying to uphold. So these are all organizational and broader ways that ethical positions are reinforced, I guess. So social responsibility, you might think of this as still using, or it may still be useful to think about stakeholders in terms of your analysis. But now you're not only thinking about ethics, which is one level of, I guess, commitment, for a lack of a better term at this point. But responsibility, you may not have an ethical obligation to a particular party or a particular group or particular entity, but you may want to take on some responsibility anyway. So, for example, you may want to be a good corporate citizen and make contributions, not necessarily monetary contributions, but you may want to be a good corporate citizen and think about your role in the community and how you might contribute to, in some positive way beyond the traditional way of just providing jobs, how you might want to contribute some positive way to the community. And so this diagram is kind of an interesting diagram because it starts to think about social responsibility in that broader context. So the chapter then also thinks about or talks about some of these different it provides some examples. It goes through some examples to try to create some context around these ideas that we've kind of introduced here. And so I just made a couple of notes and pointed out a few different things. One of the arguments against, I guess, greater ethics in business or a larger social responsibility role for businesses is this idea that businesses have a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, that is their primary objective. And there is some credence to that argument because shareholders vote, and they vote for a board of directors, and the board of directors elects the officers of an entity, and the officers of the entity are then beholden to produce returns for the shareholders. Now, a couple of things here. There is starting to be what are called B corporations, which is sort of a new development in the landscape, which are corporations that have a different charter that allows them to take in the totality of their responsibilities rather than just their responsibilities to the shareholders. And so there's been a legal shift to create the option for different kinds of entities. And the other caveat I would add here too is that there are several financial studies from, like PhD people that are studying finances that show that corporations that are better corporate citizens tend to have less legal action taken against them, and so they ultimately end up being more profitable than, less responsible corporations. So doing good can sometimes be the best course of action because it ultimately leads to the best long-term profitability, because it avoids many of the other problems that you might run into. So, that's just some developments in that space that I think are worth keeping an eye on as you sort of go about learning and developing your business career. Of course, employee health and safety been a big issue for a long time. You can go back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, into the early part of the 1900s. Working conditions were very difficult, and eventually we got OSHA, which sort of creates the workers' comp situation and requires a higher level of safety for employees than what might have been occurring prior to the legislation. And so this is sort of ethics being codified into law. There's some discussion in the chapter about sexual harassment, a difficult issue for businesses. I'm going to leave this one for now. I mean, I'm sure you're aware there's a lot happening with this right now, both in the media and in terms of movements within society to try to improve the overall outcome in this area. When we get more into law and when you later go into a full-blown business law class, the legal obligations of a business will be spelled out much more fully. But remember that the legal standard is always the minimum, and so there is still room beyond the legal minimum to try to have a positive impact by creating policies and procedures that are more favorable, and also working hard to create a culture that is more, that is just a much better climate. And then product safety and liability. This is an issue also. You'll see that when you get on to law as well, that there is both ethical standards here, and then there are minimum legal standards. We can all think of product safety issues that can become a real problem for companies. The old one that we used to always point to were the exploding Ford Pintos. The new one you might point to, you might take a look at Boeing and their 737 MAX and the problems they've had with that in there. I don't think there's any question that that's a very large concern for the company, and it has had a significant impact on their financial performance. So things to think about. More examples that come up, in the latter part of the chapter when they start paying with these things. Equal pay and diversity. We have some legislative action in these areas. The Equal Employment Opportunity Act comes into play here. And there's a lot of discussion about social equity, social justice, diversity, and the proper role of corporations and businesses as we try to look at these broader social problems and how business might be contributing in a positive or negative way to these challenges that we face. Community and volunteerism. I think you could probably give some examples of some companies in your community or wherever you're from, or from our community here in the Lane County metropolitan area. Companies that are known for being involved in the community and having, volunteering to participate and do more than just the minimum that's required of a business. Social causes. There's a lot of these that kind of take place around the margins of business. There's fair trade certifications within the apparel industry. There's the Blue Designs certification. I don't know if it still exists, but there was a marketing movement called Red for a while that was largely committed to decreasing the prevalence of HIV positive outbreaks in Africa. And so you will see businesses engage different social causes at different times. And to be fair, some of this is both marketing self-interest, and it is also a genuine concern about these particular problems. Unfortunately, it's often difficult to separate out what is both good for the company and good for society in general. And so I don't know if that's a problem, but it's just something I guess you'll have to evaluate for yourself. And then, of course, environment and sustainability. There's lots of things happening in that space as well. I found this diagram from the text to be somewhat interesting, because you can kind of almost look at companies and see where they're where they're at with their thinking on this. And part of where they're at may be a function of how much political pressure they come under, how visible they are to end consumers, how powerful and organized their consumers might be. But you can see companies at times that are just defensive, and then sometimes they, it's like, okay, well, we'll just comply with the rule or the law. Then they'll start to incorporate it a little bit more into their business, into their managerial thinking. Then they'll start to get strategic about it. And then they'll really start to think, that they have a larger role to play in some kind of a civil dialogue in a civil society. And so, and you might... you might think about different businesses that you're aware of and where you might place them on this particular scale, I guess, or stages of development or stages of evolution in their thinking. So that's chapter 2. It's really a quick overview. What I would take away from this, besides the terminology and the language that helps you understand and participate in the discussion, is how difficult this is for business because of the different stakeholders, the different ways of evaluating, and the different expectations of them. And I think that tension that in which they operate, where they're pulled in these many different directions, is a challenge to navigate. And so I think increasing your awareness in this area will be useful as you just sort of evaluate the news and you evaluate companies and you think about who you might want to partner with in terms of your participation in the economy, and finding a spot where you can feel comfortable with how they operate because it's in alignment with how you think about the world. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you, or we'll hear you, or you'll hear me at least, in the next chapter. Thank you.